And he said to me, he said the saving in that particular fleet of about 50 tractors and 90 odd trailers was in almost $100,000. By investing 8 and 10% more in that brake job, he saved all that money.
In each episode of the Parts for Trucks podcast, you will walk away with tools, strategies, and knowledge to make your job easier, cut costs, and elevate your performance in the heavy-duty trucking industry. In this episode, we are going to talk about the only thing stopping 80,000 pounds from crashing into you and your family. That's right, we're talking about brakes on commercial trucks and trailers.
Welcome to the Parts for Trucks podcast, where we explore the latest trends, technologies, and strategies in the heavy-duty trucking industry. Each episode, you'll hear from industry experts to help keep your trucks on the road and your business thriving. Now, let's get into gear. Here's your host, Jamie Irvin.
Now, let me give you a little background on the subject of brakes as it relates to commercial vehicles here in Canada. According to Transport Canada, there are approximately 3 million commercial vehicles on the road. Of those 3 million, 553,905 of them are in the Class 7 and 8 category, meaning they weigh 11,794 kilograms or more. And this is according to the most up-to-date statistics that we have, which brings us up to 2023. So those numbers get us into the ballpark of what the condition is today on our Canadian roads. Brake Safety Week will be conducted this year between August 24th and 30th, 2025. Last year, the CVSA conducted 1,926 inspections during Brake Safety Week here in Canada. How'd we do? Well, of those 1,926 inspections, 243 of those inspections led to brake-related out-of-service violations. That means that 12.6% of the inspections done here in Canada ended with a brake-related out-of-service violation. So there's obviously room for improvement. I'm sure you've got some questions about brakes. I've got some questions about brakes. Things that I want to know are, what's the best brakes for trucks that are going to be in the Canadian market, that are going to travel on Canadian roads, dealing with the kind of unique Canadian conditions that we often experience? Another question is, how do you figure out what the brake you just chose for your commercial truck or trailer is going to cost you in total? Not just the purchase price, but the total cost. And what's happening when it comes to the types of brakes that we're seeing on commercial trucks and trailers? The SCAM or foundation brakes have been very consistent for many decades, but we also have seen the emergence of air disc brake technology, which is advancing quite rapidly. So what's the story there? It's these kinds of questions that we're going to answer in today's episode. Which leads me to our first guest. Our first guest is Joe Kay. He's the Director of Brake Engineering North America for Cummins Meritor. Now, Joe has been with the brake engineering team for 30 years. Joe started when the company was Rockwell International. He has been with the company through several changes when they became Meritor, and now they're part of Cummins. He has expertise in everything related to both foundation brakes and air disc brakes and all of the components. And as the Director of Brake Engineering, he works with both the original equipment and aftermarket teams. So this is someone who we can really benefit from his knowledge. Joe, welcome to the Parts for Trucks podcast. So glad to have you here.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm kind of excited to do this. I always like to share some of my knowledge that I've gained over the last 30 years in brake systems. So hopefully we can get some good answers for you today.
Well, and brakes are kind of important, right? Because when you're talking about stopping 80,000 pounds from smashing into you and your family or careening off one of our highways, brakes are kind of important. So let me ask you something. If you're operating a commercial truck and trailer with air brakes, what typically are the top 1 or 2 problems involved in making sure that you are getting the best performance out of your brakes and that everything is going well?
We always recommend, do your service intervals, make sure, operators are going around looking at your vehicles, just, from your CDL operation license. We always recommend that. And so brake health is a big piece of it. As far as when it comes down to, like what kind of things, are typically seen happening, your brake pad life and drum or rotor life, depending if you're running disc or drum, but that's usually some of the bigger things that, there happen. Brakes today, they use what we call a wearable friction material, so, we haven't come up with anything, earth shattering or magical. So, the brake pads will still wear. There's energy exchange that we want to make sure happens correctly in order for that vehicle to stop, in the distance that it needs to. So then the other thing is like your drum or your rotor, making sure that that's, very functional, in good shape, no cracks, no missing pieces, things like that. And these are some of the basic things that the Department of Transportation will look at, if they're stopping your vehicle and taking a look at it too. They kind of start with those pieces, then they'll kind of go through the brake system and, make sure the slack adjuster. If you have a drum brake, it's really easy to check to see if your brake is functioning. They'll have you apply the brake, and, like if your brake stroke is too long, may indicate that you got a slack adjuster issue and you'd have to change that component.
Well, that brings me to selecting the right friction material for your vocation and making sure that you're matching up the friction material that you're buying, the components that you're buying, matching that up to the actual needs of the environment that you're operating in. It's a little more complex than I think a lot of people realize. And certainly when we get a chance to talk to people with your level of experience, it's pretty quickly we can understand why this is such a complex answer. And obviously it's important for distributors like us to be able to have this information to guide our customers to make good decisions when we're recommending your products as the manufacturer. So let me ask you, let's start right at the beginning. 101, how does friction material actually work?
In order to retard the vehicle or stop the vehicle, we have to apply a very large force to the brake shoe or the brake pad, and then that brake pad rubs up against the drum or the rotor. That interaction causes friction. It causes heat, and that heat is what we call a thermal exchange. That's how the energy exchange happens. You probably heard it, kind of at high levels, but the function of that brake friction material is to do just that. It's to rub against the drum and, create that energy exchange. There's a lot of different elements that actually get used in friction materials, and, kind of a theory, you get what you pay for, right? With all materials and everything. And so, and it kind of goes into, like what the fleet's objective is and what they're trying to get out of it too. If you got a fleet that's running lots of miles and they don't really use the brakes very often, or not very lightly, they might be looking at just like doing one brake change, for the life of their vehicle, at some point. Whereas other fleets, the other end of the scale is like a transit or maybe a refuse vehicle that does a lot of stops, every quarter mile or so, they're just hitting the brakes really hard. And so they'll wear at different rates. They'll wear at different temperatures. I always recommend, talking to, distributors like yourself, trying to, get a match that they like. There could be, a good combinations for sure.
So this is one of the reasons why we encourage our outside salespeople and our counter people and our branches to work closely with our suppliers, because you have the expertise on the product. We have the knowledge of the customer's specific needs, and we can bring that together into a solution. You said something a moment ago that caught my attention. You alluded to the fact that you rarely get more than you pay for. So when somebody puts together a cheap or low cost friction, they have to take something out of the material. What do they typically take out of the material to bring the cost down on the friction material? And what is the result of taking those things out?
it's usually like in those lubricants and in the abrasives, the size of the abrasive materials. Some of the cost is even in how pure it is has an effect, and so it's just like anything. The more processing you do to get something pure, the cost is going to go up, right? And so these are some of the trade-offs that you can do, and in some cases it works fine. We always recommend. I think most friction supplier brake suppliers would provide some kind of detailed data around performance curve or something, usually like a FMVSS 121, like a dyno test report, or like in the brochures. A lot of times that kind of information usually is there, so you can kind of see what the performance would be expected to be there.
Right. But as you mentioned, when you take out the higher quality materials, so the reason I just want to linger on this for a moment, because let's face it, if you're in Canada, you have to meet the minimum braking distances set out in the Canadian Motor Vehicle Safety Standards. So when a supplier sells brakes to the Canadian market, they have to meet that standard, just like they do in the United States. And so that means that even if you do buy a lower quality, or let's say a lower priced friction material, your vehicle will stop in that distance and will meet that requirement. But I think you said the key thing. How long will that brake last, right? Because that's what ends up happening when you take out all of this high quality material. You end up impacting the performance. Talk to me a little bit more about that.
You can kind of think of it like a chocolate chip cookie, right? If we both made up a batch of cookies, and if you use a little bit more, baking soda and I use a little bit more flour, that formula it'll be different, right? The cookie will look different, it'll taste different, everything will be different. And so what we want to do with friction materials is make sure the total package, including, like the quality and how well everything gets measured, and then how well it gets, mixed together. And then and it goes into like a mold where it's, put in. You got to put it in at the right amounts, and it gets pressed into the right shape, so we get the right density of the material. Then it goes from there and go into a curing oven, and you want to make sure that it's cured in the oven, for the right amount of time and at the right temperature to get a pure cure. So it's kind of a combination of all these things. I'm saying it makes a really good quality type of a friction material. From the elements that we put in all the way through, taking it out of the oven and labeling it at the end of the day as well.
Yeah, so you're buying a cheap, stale chocolate chip cookie with 3 chocolate chips in it, or you're buying some really good chocolate chunk cookies filled with all the good stuff, right?
Yep.
So it's a good illustration.
Right, it'll fall apart on you, and if it's baked just right, it'll taste good, and So
exactly. Yeah, well, chocolate chip cookies are my favorite cookies, so I wasn't expecting to talk about that today.
All right.
Okay, so again, just to reiterate this point, if you are trying to save money by buying lower quality friction that sacrifices performance when you need it, it's going to drive up your total cost. Later in the episode, we are going to supply you with a couple use cases from some of our customers who experienced this firsthand. It increased their purchase price a little bit, but it dramatically decreased their total cost of operation. So stay with us for that. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about a couple other subjects related to brakes. Okay, so to our audience on YouTube, I want you to put in the comments right now, what percentage of commercial trucks on North American roads have air disc brakes? So we're just talking about trucks here. Is it 12 to 15%, 18 to 25%, 26 to 30%, or is it closer to 50%? Put it in the comments, and we're going to answer that question in just a minute. So let's talk about how brakes were very consistent for many decades. Early in my career, it was all S-Cam brakes, pretty consistent, same products. There was some changes to the friction material. There was some changes to design, but this was slow and over a number of years. And then we had the introduction of air disc brake, which really promised a lot, but adoption of it was very slow. There's been several iterations of air disc brakes, and it seems to now be catching on. So tell me a little bit from your perspective, let's talk about the history of air disc brake and why was it so slow to come on and for people to adopt it? And why now is it becoming more popular?
30 years ago, I got hired into, it was Rockwell at the time, and I got hired in to work on the new disc brake, because it was coming on. It was going to be, take on the, everything in the world. I would say the biggest issue with it is like acquisition cost, was really slow to take off. And that's probably been one of the bigger drivers, with delaying the implementation of it. We've done a really good job with that, getting that piece down. There was another element that kind of it was hurting the disc brake, piece was, and you're probably familiar with this, getting service parts out there.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That problem is, I don't think it's completely solved, but it's way, way better than it ever has. It does bring a nice performance, and anybody that's driving their passenger car right now, they're all disc brakes. They, stop very, consistently, very evenly. Disc brakes has kind of helped, bring that feel to them where, like, I'm sure, like some people that have driven like even older drum brakes, right? You got to make sure you're holding onto that wheel with both hands. And, they do very well, but, in emergency situations and things like that, I think, overall the performance of a disc brake will just give a smoother, more consistent stop.
Yeah, between AMT transmissions and disc brakes, trucks have come a long way compared to those old days for sure. So let's get to what percentage of commercial vehicles have SCAM, what percentage of vehicles have air disc brakes? So we asked that question a little earlier. What's the answer? How many trucks and trailers in North America are running air disc brake right now?
Our data is showing we're about 50-50 with disc brakes and drum brakes.
Okay.
On trailers, we're about 15%, 1.5 on disc brakes for trailers and the remainder drum brakes. On like medium duty trucks, that kind of combination, we're similar, about 15% disc brakes on trucks. That market hasn't quite seen the big benefits to go after the disc brakes. We see a trend to keep going up overall in disc brakes. In fact, by 2030, we're projecting somewhere around 75%.
So 50%, that's actually a higher number than I actually thought originally. I personally thought it was closer to like 30%. So on North American Class 8 trucks, we're talking about 50% now being on air disc brake, and that's going to grow. So what did you put in the comments? Were you right? Let me know if you were right. Thank you so much, Joe, for coming on and sharing with us your extensive knowledge. I really appreciate you being on the Parts for Trucks podcast.
Yep. Anytime I can share it, I enjoy these kind of things. Yep.
What a great interview. Joe has such a wealth of experience, and it's this kind of partnership with our vendors that Parts for Trucks is working really hard to bring you these subject matter experts who can talk about the products that are in the market with such a authority and with so much great information to help us out. Now, our next guest is a Parts for Trucks legend. And in this discussion, we're going to go deep into the financial impact of what you choose when you're buying brakes for your commercial trucks and trailers. We're going to talk about how to identify the brakes and give you almost like a little mini masterclass. And it's really my pleasure to introduce our next guest. Robert Goodwin is the manager of customer care help desk in Eastern Canada for Parts for Trucks. Robert has 53 years of experience in heavy duty parts. Of that 53 years, he spent the last 38 years with Parts for Trucks. Robert, welcome to the Parts for Trucks podcast. Very happy to have you here.
Thank you very much, Jamie. I appreciate the invite.
How much does it cost when you use cheap brakes that need to be changed more regularly? So when you think about brakes, people often just look at the purchase price, right? But how much does it actually cost somebody if they use a cheap brake that's not matched to their vocation or their application, and they end up having to change the brakes more regularly?
From my experience from years past and up until now, I've seen people make big mistakes buying the wrong friction material, I've seen them have to do brake work over. That's double the work. And it's double the time, and it gobbles up shop time, and it's just a bad scene.
Yeah, so let's break it down. You make a good point. So first of all, you look at the purchase price of the original friction material, and you see that invoice. So your head can kind of capture, okay, what does that cost me? But what so many people fail to think about, to your point, is if I have to change this friction material again in, let's say, 6 or 8 months. So you've got labor, you've got having to purchase more product, but what about downtime? Like, how expensive is that to a fleet?
Well, that can be huge. It depends on how dedicated the unit is. You can't go to Ryder and rent just whatever you want. If it's a refuse truck, what are you going to do? You're down until the wheels are moving again. So it's very important to try to pick the right product for the job the first time if you can do it. And that's what we're here for, is to try to help people, guide them through and around some of the potholes that are made off. And you are right, Jamie. Very often, friction material is picked based on price. What's the flyer price from competitor A? Can you meet it? Is it the same? And a lot of the mistake is made that if it's 20,000 pound rated brake lining, well, they're all the same. If it's 23,000 pound rated brake lining, that segment is all the same. But it couldn't be further from the truth. It's very important to pick the right material for the application. And that's where it really stops, right there.
It's absolutely true. So let's talk about the other side of that coin. What happens to your total cost of operation? Because really that's what we're talking about. We're talking about shifting from looking at our purchase price to looking at our total cost of operation. So what happens to our total cost of operation when we do the following? 1, we invest in a high quality friction material. And 2, we match that up to our vocation so that it lasts longer.
Well, it's going to certainly keep the unit out of the shop. And that allows the shop all the time in the world to do other things. And the shop is cleaner. There is no question about it. And that goes along with occupation health and safety. And the mechanics and the techs that work around and shop labor, they're happier. And the turnover amongst that staff, it just improves everything for everybody. Less turnover, happier staff, cleaner shop, and the work gets done better. When you're in a well-lit, clean shop, safety rises and the quality of the work comes right along with it. So that just throws the truck on the road for way more kilometers. And when you start looking at shop maintenance, you can't beat that. To utilize all the time possible to do all that you can without going out and buying any labor if it's necessary. It's huge. And sometimes it's only found by trial and error and a few mistakes. And we've helped people over the years eliminate some of those mistakes.
Yeah, and I have seen what you are talking about, which is there is a alignment between moving off of a purchase price mindset to a total cost of operation mindset. When you do that at the fleet level, there's a connection between making that shift in how you approach purchasing and, for example, buying brakes and all these other aspects of operating a efficient fleet, operating an efficient shop. That correlation is definitely there. And that has been proven time and time again from fleets all over the country. We're really talking to our counter people now, as well as our people in sales. They're discussing friction material with our customers on a daily basis. Can you walk us through how our people on the counter, our outside salespeople, should help a customer to specify the right friction material for their vocation or application? Walk us through that process.
Well, you kind of have to divide the question into two. Number one, do we know the customer? Do we know the fleet? How well do we know the fleet? What have been the pitfalls in the past? And what can be corrected through getting the correct friction material? And the other side is that person that comes in for the first time. He has his old cores with him, and he's just looking to buy some brakes and get out the door. And we don't know much about him or his fleet. So knowing the fleet operation, like, is it a low bed fleet? We may approach a 12.25 inch brake quite different than a 16.5 inch brake. So that is one thing. And then whether is it a tridem? Is it a tandem fleet? Is it a tridem fleet, or is it a quad fleet? And the more axles there are, the more they have to work the same and be in unison. So we have to be careful and pick a piece of brake lining that's tolerant of some of these, inconsistencies. Is the fleet a tractor-operated fleet, or are they leasehold tractor operation? That can affect the operation of the brakes on the trailer or whichever immensely. Sometimes there's a cost threshold. When you go to buy milk in a grocery store, you think about how much it is. You sort of go, wow, that's gone up in price. You pass the threshold, that little moment that's there. Don't get caught by that sometimes. We really have to find the right product to go the right cost per mile. And then, does the fleet have high horsepower engines? You give a driver horsepower, they're going to use it. So we better give him good brake horsepower because he's going to use it too. It just goes hand in hand. And then we have to have just a little bit of understanding of what season we're going into. You get into some of the more southern parts of the provinces here in Canada and understanding that trucks are going to run US. There's a lot of gear that runs Florida, California. What kind of heat are they going to get into? So we got to manage that heat, remember. So all of this kind of comes into play, and it can be very stressful for a counterperson to show he knows what he's talking about, or she, and get these questions in their mind figured out before they approach the price and the product that's going to be sold to the customer. So there's a lot to it, Jamie.
Robert, you did a great job of summarizing various ways that we need to think about the customer, their needs. And you brought up so many good points. I think that it's just important for all of our people on the counter, in sales, when they are talking to our customers, to have that conversation. Sometimes when time is of the essence and, they just need parts and in and out, you don't think, that's not necessarily the time to have that complete conversation. But you need to get to know your customers. You need to have these conversations on a regular basis with them, because at the end of the day, the more education we can bring, the more we can help them to make good decisions when it comes to things like friction material, the more that trust between us and the customer is developed. And if you're listening right now and you are one of our customers, we want you to understand that we really care about giving you not just the product that you ask for necessarily, but the product that you actually need, because we want you to be successful. The more successful you are, the more successful ultimately we are. And it really helps us to fulfill our mission to support the trucking industry. Okay, so can you go through the basics of how to identify our SCAM brakes? Walk us through the process that you go through when you're teaching people how to do this.
Okay, Jamie, if we were to look at drive axle brake 16.5 by 7 as a standard size, just to keep it simple for the sake of the podcast here, in the dual anchor pin style brake that Meritor or Rockwell in the early days was known as, came into being. In the early days, it was 2 anchor pins or 1, sir. That was the question. Mm-hmm. And if it was 1, we knew that it had to be an Eaton brake, which I'll get into in a second. But if it was 2 anchor pins that held these shoes in place inside that wheel envelope, it had to be a Meritor brake. So in the early days, it was 3/4 inch thick block, piece of cake. Along comes design change, and they decide to make this Q Plus brake. How are we going to differentiate it? Well, we're going to take the hump that was in the web of the Q shoe, the 3/4 inch thick block. We're going to take it away, so there'll be no hump. If that is gone, it's going to be a Q Plus brake, which has 7/8 inch thick block. And for the short time, it got mixed up like you wouldn't believe. So it became very confusing. So the second way to check it is the spacing between the rivet holes at either end of that brake shoe, because they have the Friction Materials Standards Institute have a standard for all these drill holes. So the spacing on a Q Plus brake will be wider between the rivet holes than a standard 45-15 3/4 block. So that's a way to check it. The other way is take a look at the S-cam head, and if it's 1 3/8 inches across the neck of the cam, it's the old Q style brake. Do not try to put a Q Plus on.
Yeah.
If it's 1 1/8 inch, you can put both a Q and a Q plus on, but you just have to rotate the camshaft just that little more so that the rise of the S's on a Q plus cam are longer than on a Q by its machining. So that kind of tucks the Rockwell or the Meritor brake and all the other brands that run on that same platform, which could be Hendrickson, the Bendix Spicer style dual anchor pin brakes are all on that same dimensional characteristic of that dual anchor pin. When we go over to the Eaton brake, which utilizes a big single anchor pin, the shoe sits on either side of that one big pin, it's easier. The webbing on the old style or the early 4311 or the early style Eaton brake had a web that was not straight from the anchor pin to the roller. It came in narrower towards the roller, and the rollers were two-piece. So if you had an Eaton brake that had that design with a two-piece roller, you had to put that Eaton standard 4311 brake back on. When the ES2 come along, they went to a one-piece roller and went to a 7/8 thick block themselves. And that brake shoe, brand spanking new out of the box, is a non-tapered brake block. The cam and the anchor end look the same. In fact, they're easily mixed up in a reman shop if you're not careful. It's because the taper is built into the shoe. So that allows you to get the 7/8 thick block in where you took the old 3/4 inch one off. But the same camshaft rules apply. If it's 1 3/8 on across the neck, you have to put a 4515 back on, or the old standard Eaton style. If you convert that over to an 1 1/8 camshaft, you can convert it to either an ES1 or an ES2. And that presents another little differentiation. The early conversion to an ES style or 7/8 thick block for an Eaton had tabs on the end of the shoe table. The ES2 had the return spring holes or the anchor pin retainer holes were a part of the actual shoe table. The table was just a little longer to allow them to have the holes there. But either way, a much greater improvement in brake life when we found that extra little 1/8 of an inch. That 1/8 of an inch adds so many more miles. So it's obviously very wise to get that on whenever it's possible.
The reason I ask you that question is because I just wanted people to get a sense of how much goes into proper identification of friction material. And we just talked about our 16.5 by 7 brakes. We didn't talk about drive or steer axle. We didn't talk about other dimensions. So it's very important for you to understand these different characteristics of the brakes and to learn how to identify them, how to take proper measurements, how to both visually, but then to double check that your initial visual identification is actually accurate and it's going to meet the needs of the customer. Now, when we shift to air disc brake, it's a completely different scenario. So could you give us some best practices for helping parts people identify air disc brakes?
Well, if the first is a visual. If you were to stand at the back of the trailer, if it's a trailer or even a truck, you'll notice that the brake chambers are fastened perpendicular to the wheel. Once you get the wheels off, they kind of look all the same. So careful identification of the caliper is probably one of the quicker ways. Bendix is very good about identifying their caliper. In fact, on North American built trailers that have Bendix air disc brakes on, it's either an ADB22 or in recent years ADB22 LTs. But some other manufacturers will use other versions of that Norbrems or Bendix, as we know them in North America, caliper, and could use an ST7 or an SK7 caliper, as SAF Holland has done. Those two calipers will have tags, a blue tag or a green tag, and each one will say which style that it is. And SAF Holland have a very, very good wall chart that we can provide anybody that would like to have one, that almost model by model, as they have transitioned through design changes into different spindle configurations and other things that they've tried to make improvements on. It'll take you right through it. It's probably one of the more confusing ones. Believe me, Jamie, this is one of the biggest challenges we have as a parts distributor, aftermarket parts distributor, is to identify air disc brake designs. Because there are so many trailer builders that maybe in one model year, they lean towards Haldex or SAF Holland. And then the first thing you know, there's a Wabco under whatever this wheel is. It can be really, really tricky. You really got to pull that pad off. The pad will tell us exactly what is on that unit for air disc brake.
When I was learning the parts business and we were focused more on the S-Cam style brakes, when we were identifying drums, you were looking at the bolt hole pattern, the number of studs, and we would take measurements, and then we had our charts and we could compare them. Is there something similar for the actual disc in the air disc brake system?
Yes, there is, but air disc brakes are a whole different animal. The hub has to be pulled in every case to change the rotor. There is a hat style, there's a flat style, there's a spline style to these rotors. And depending on the brand of the air disc brake system, they will employ one or another or whatever. There is no rule of thumb, really, that is reliable. He didn't know what he's into until that trailer's in and the wheels are off. Oh my God, what's in it? What's this? Where am I going to go for this? So it's in our best interest to be right up on the right questions to ask. Is it a hat style? Is it a spline style? How many split studs are there? Is there a number on the hub? That steel or aluminum hub should have a number on it. That usually is designed to marry up only with a certain style rotor. So if we can find one or the other, we can get the guy going. We keep a wide variety of air disc brake componentry, especially hubs and rotors.
Robert, thank you so much for going through that in such detail. I really appreciate it. I'd like to shift the conversation now to back to that conversation that we had earlier where we were talking about resisting the urge to look at just purchase price, to really invest in high quality friction material that is going to lower your total cost of operation. Could you share with me an example of a customer that we had who overcame the urge to buy cheap brakes, made the investment, and what was the situation and what ended up happening?
So we get a call from an outside salesman, have this fleet that began buying brakes from us by the skid. And here in Atlantic Canada, it happens, but it's more unusual than 8 or 10 boxes of brakes at a time. Whole skid. Wow, what's going on? And then it shifts from, wow, I'm spending a lot of money. I got to try to get the cost down on all this product. And then the question comes through, you've got to have something cheaper. Well, we take the box out of the picture. We take the hardware kit out to make the price look better. It does, but you're not getting a hardware kit. You need it. And after a while, we got to a spot where there's no more room to go. There's no more cost savings to be had. Finally, the outside salesman for this customer said, when can you come visit with me to visit this customer? He's going through brakes on a pretty regular basis. Got to help him. So we sit down with the customer, and the first thing comes up, you've got to lower my cost per mile. I said, okay. We need to talk about you buying a more expensive, higher quality brake. And he just sat back in his chair. What makes you think I'm going to go for that? I'm already spending too much. So we went through the process of talking about cost per mile, produce this little form. We talk about it with the customer. And I said to the customer, it's going to be a year's worth of commitment. Your fleet is large enough. We're going to have to go through all your trucks and all your trailers and upgrade them to this better product. If you've got the stomach for that in your budget, you're going to be the winner. Well, fast forward. A year goes, and actually it was like 14 months go by. We have another meeting. And all along we have phone conversations, how we doing, little updates and all this and that. We sit down And he said to me, the saving in that particular fleet of about 50 tractors and 90 odd trailers was in almost $100,000. And it was a big enough number. They didn't believe it, but it was. By investing 8 and 10% more in that brake job, he saved all that money. So the proof is in the pudding, Jamie.
Yeah.
But you have to have the stomach to see it through. There is better product out there, and it will do what we say it will do.
Robert, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Robert Goodwin is our manager of customer care help desk in Eastern Canada. He has 53 years experience in heavy duty parts, and we were so glad to have you on the podcast where we could get a little bit of that experience from you. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you very much, Jamie, for the invitation. Really enjoyed the opportunity. Thank you.
I told you Robert was a legend. He didn't disappoint. You can really hear his years of experience when he's talking about the subject of brakes. Now, it's one thing to select the correct brake parts for your application and making a good purchase decision. It's another to make sure that the service work on your vehicle, especially when it comes to your brakes, is done correctly. And this episode wouldn't be complete without a discussion about the fundamentals of both inspecting and repairing your brakes. To help us with that, I have invited Phil Hutton, service manager in our Dartmouth location, to the podcast to talk to us about the service side of brakes. Phil, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jamie. Nice to be here.
Glad to have you here. And, we've been talking about brakes in this episode, and I wanted to conclude this episode with a discussion about just exactly what's involved to kind of give people an idea, maybe drivers or parts people, they're involved in the process, but they don't really know what the technicians do to make sure that brakes are inspected correctly and make sure that when they do that inspection, we're able to catch things before they become a problem. So let's go through the steps together. What is the first step that a technician should do when preparing to do a brake inspection?
Well, firstly, Jamie, obviously we've got to talk about the safety aspects. We've got to make sure that the truck is in the right position, secured with wheel chocks and all the usual safety stuff. If we're going to be lifting the truck up, we've got to make sure that the jacks and the axle stands are the right rating and that everything is correct. Let's just get that one out of the way because obviously it's paramount to us, safety. So firstly, with a brake check, we want to look generally from outside, we want to look at all the components are in the right place, the brake chambers where they should be and securely fastened, so we're just looking at general security to start with before we start getting into the nitty gritty of it. So that's what generally we're looking at. Wheels are in place, nuts, that sort of thing, because all these are going to have a factor on the braking system as a whole in general. So
what I'm hearing is proper preparation prevents poor performance.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. So from the safety perspective, when we have the vehicle safely secured, we're confident now that we can move forward. Is there anything on the tooling side that usually you like to get ready ahead of time or you like to have your technicians prepare? Walk me through just what they do there and what is the first step of the inspection?
In a wheel-off inspection, obviously we're going to be having the wheels off. They're going to need a wheel gun, sockets and all that stuff. Probably a hammer. Tape measure is going to be key in this situation. Nothing too technical regards tooling, but those are some of the few things that will be needed as we move through this. So
okay, so now I've got the safety. I've got my tools ready. Let's get into the actual inspection. Talk to me about that initial visual inspection. What is the technician looking for?
Again, we're looking for obvious signs of breakage, brake linings that are either cracked, broken, or missing, bent steelwork. Things are in the right place. Springs, there's 2 or 3 springs involved inside the brakes, making sure that everything is in place and where it should be. Rollers, there's anchor pins, rollers, there's various items that need to be in place. We're going to look at things like, are we lubricated properly? The generalization, we're going to look at things like, are the chambers correct from one side to the other? Things happen in the field. Things get changed because there isn't one available and they need to get out of a tight spot. So we've got to make sure that chambers are correct, slack adjusters are the same from side to side, because it's good practice to have the same items and makes and models on the same vehicle. So those are the sorts of things that we're going to, as we start getting deeper into it, those are the key points that we need to take care of before we move further.
Yeah, it's a good point about things being the same, both sides of the axle. You're absolutely right. Those things do happen and that. So let's just go on an assumption here that we haven't found anything obviously broken, but we still need to assess whether or not a brake job is needed. So these are wear items. So walk me through the process of establishing, okay, do I need to change the drums? Do I need to change the friction material? How do we get there?
There's a fair bit of measuring. There is, from the linings, there is a certain thickness requirement that's needed. Good signs, on a larger truck, we have rivets. Obviously, if they're protruding or wearing, then we're obviously needed changing things. But there are other shoes available where they're bonded, so rivets are not clear. So there are minimum requirements for certain shoe thicknesses and linings that have to be met for MVI or safety standards. Drums, likewise, they come at a certain size and they have to meet those requirements. So on a 16.5-inch drum, as an example, although they can change, you're allowed 120 thousandths oversize. So that goes from 16.5 to 16.620. Those are your maximum figures, and it's got to fall in between those. So those are the nuts and bolts of brakes, so to speak. The shoes and the drums. There's a lot more surrounding them. When you go into measuring things. A big complaint of a lot of customers is they got 300,000 out of their first brake job, and the next brake job only lasted 150,000 or 200,000. Why is that? They think we sell substandard parts or along those lines. What they've got to realise, if they're changing their own parts, they have to make sure that camshaft bushings, all the things fall within spec, because any wear on these is going to add extra wear further down the line. So spending a little bit of money, bringing those cams back up to specifications would pay off dividends down the line in longevity of the job that you're doing. So
in addition to all of the foundation brake components, what about the general air brake system that this is all connected to? What do you do there to make sure that you're not missing anything?
So specifically, the technician's bringing it in, and I would advise that any technician does this. It's a brake problem, but let's get back to the thing that's activating them, that's doing that, the air system, right? So when we're checking brakes and you're doing adjustments, so to speak, make sure when we're checking stroke length that has to be between 90 and 100 psi. Firstly, can the truck achieve that? You've got to make sure that it can get up to the air pressure required. You also want to check that we're not leaking. So putting your foot on the brake, building up to pressure first. Let's stop, 2 minutes. Does that pressure drop? Put your foot on the brake, same procedure again. Do we get any pressure droppage? You don't want to see much more than 5 psi drop over those two items where you're just checking. That means, your air system is in good standing, and, you make a reasonable assumption that you can move forward with the rest of the repair.
Yeah. So now you've done all of this work. You've replaced the necessary parts. You're putting it all back together again. When we're at that point, what do we have to think about in terms of making sure the brakes are properly adjusted and functionally testing them to make sure that everything is good?
We're going to check the brake stroke now. So we're going to adjust the slack adjusters, and we're going to check for free play first. So we adjust the slack adjuster to where we think it should be, and then we're going to check free play. That's the distance between the brake shoe and the drum before it makes contact. How we do that as a technician, we'll take a lever and pry on that slack adjuster, and we're looking for a measurement between somewhere around 5/8 to 7/8 of an inch. And how we measure that is from the base of the chamber to normally the center pin of the slack adjuster, the clevis pin. So that's the free play you're kind of looking for. And remember, that is just a guideline at this stage. You know what I mean? Next, what you'll have to do is making sure the air is up to pressure. Apply the brakes with a, between a 90 and 100 psi air pressure. This should give you a full brake stroke application. And again, you have to measure the brake strokes. Now, depending on the chambers, the position of the chambers, the size of the chambers, that stroke does change. So I'm not going to tell you, it's going to be an inch and a half or 2 inches or whatever it is, but there is specifications out there. So whether you've got somebody to help you, press the brake pedal, or you've got something that enables you to do that. So that's where you go from. Also, what I would check, and not a lot of people do, again, those things are changed out in the field. Were they done correctly? Checking brake geometry is important as well. When the brakes are fully, depressed and you've got a full brake stroke application, the push rod of the chamber and the slack adjuster should be at 90 degrees. This will give you your maximum, force available to you. You know what I mean? Not a lot of that is checked very often. We make a lot of assumptions, so that's important to check that too.
So as you can tell, there's quite a bit to this. Now, the brake job is done to the Parts for Trucks standard, and we're ready now to give the vehicle back to our customer. What can they expect in the way of documentation? What do we do internally to make sure that we've done things correctly? What do we communicate to the customer?
Okay, so normally within the work order, we'll explain what we do, and explaining that the vehicle is now within specification to the OEM standards, and we also internally monitor those and log those measurements for future reference and any issues, obviously, that do happen in the future. We also make recommendations for the customer of any other repairs that may be needed, or along the lines of future problems that might occur for those guys. And hopefully we give the customers as much information as we can to keep them happy.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Phil, thank you so much for walking us through this process. It gives people insight into what is involved. It's one thing to buy the right parts. It's another thing to also have them installed correctly and have it all come together with a vehicle that, keeps cost of operation down and operates safely. Safety is a big concern for everyone involved. If you'd like to have one of our many service centers across the country work on one of your vehicles, head over to partsfortrucks.com/service, and you'll be able to get in contact with one of our service managers and go from there. Phil, thank you so much for taking time. I know you're busy in the shop. Really appreciate you being on the podcast.
No problem. Thanks, Jamie.
These 3 interviews have been just packed with great information. The years of experience of these 3 individuals really shone through, and it was a real privilege to be able to put this together for you. You've been listening to the Parts for Trucks podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Irvin. In this episode, we got this masterclass in brakes, but we're going to cover a lot more on the podcast than just brakes. So if you like the content that you're hearing, head over to partsfortrucks.com/podcast, or go to wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you follow the show for free so you don't miss out on any of the upcoming deep dives that we're going to do on everything related to heavy-duty parts and service. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Parts for Trucks podcast. And as always, I want to thank you for being heavy duty.